In the summer heat of 1930s Iraq, archaeologists were searching through one of the oldest inhabited regions on Earth. This was the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the birthplace of cities, writing, and some of humanity's earliest inventions. But they were not looking for a battery. They were looking for the remains of a forgotten civilization. Near the outskirts of Baghdad, an archaeological team was investigating ancient settlements connected to the Parthian period, a time when powerful kingdoms controlled this region more than 2,000 years ago. Their mission was simple: find artifacts, document history, understand how people lived thousands of years before modern technology. But deep beneath the dry soil, hidden among ordinary-looking ruins, they uncovered something that would create a mystery that still survives today.
You know, archaeologists weren't chasing some ancient super technology. They were doing what archaeologists always do, carefully uncovering the everyday lives of people who lived thousands of years ago. Then, this little clay jar showed up and changed the conversation.
A small clay jar. At first glance, it looked completely unremarkable, a simple terracotta container. The kind of object archaeologists had discovered countless times before. It was about the size of a modern drinking bottle, sealed with an unusual material, and buried among other ancient objects. Nothing about it suggested it would become one of archaeology's most debated discoveries until they opened it. Inside the jar was something unexpected, a copper cylinder, and inside that cylinder, an iron rod. The archaeologists immediately noticed something strange. The design was unusual. The iron piece appeared to have been inserted into the copper tube, while the entire structure sat inside the clay vessel. It was not a normal storage container. It was not a weapon. It was not a decorative object. It looked engineered. And that raised a question nobody expected. Was this ancient object designed to produce electricity? The idea sounded impossible, because if the interpretation was correct, it would mean people in ancient Mesopotamia may have understood a basic principle of electrochemistry nearly 2,000 years before modern batteries were invented. The object became known as the Baghdad Battery. But the story behind it was far more complicated than the name suggests.
If I'd been standing there that day, I probably would have walked right past it. Honestly, it looks like an ordinary storage jar. It's what's inside that makes you stop and say, wait a second.
The truth is, archaeologists did not find a device with a label saying battery. They found a mysterious artifact. And then scientists, historians, and researchers began trying to understand what it really was. The first theories were dramatic. Some believed it could have been an ancient electrical device. The theory was that the clay jar may have been filled with an acidic liquid, perhaps vinegar or another substance, which could react with the copper and iron, creating a small electrical charge. A primitive battery, a device built more than 1,500 years before the modern world discovered electricity. But there was a problem. Nobody knew for certain if that was actually its purpose, because the object was missing something important: evidence. No ancient writings were found explaining how to use it. No similar devices were found in large numbers. No ancient workshop manuals described electricity. The discovery created a mystery instead of solving one. And that mystery only became bigger because the Baghdad Battery was not discovered in a futuristic laboratory. It came from an ancient world where people were already masters of engineering. They built enormous cities. They created complex irrigation systems. They developed metalworking techniques They studied astronomy. They transformed civilization. So the question became, could a civilization that existed thousands of years ago have discovered something that modern science overlooked? Or was the object something much simpler that historians misunderstood? The answer would take decades to uncover.
Finding the copper cylinder and the iron rod together wasn't exactly normal. Ancient people rarely assembled materials like that without a purpose. The challenge was figuring out what that purpose actually was.
And the journey would reveal one of the most fascinating debates in archaeology. A tiny clay jar that may have been an ancient battery or one of history's greatest misinterpretations. Because sometimes the most mysterious discoveries are not the biggest ones. Sometimes they are the objects small enough to fit in your hand. When archaeologists uncovered the strange clay jar near Baghdad, they were not expecting to find a revolution. They were expecting history. Every excavation begins with patience. A small piece of pottery, a broken tool, a forgotten object left behind by people who disappeared thousands of years ago. Each discovery becomes a clue, a small window into a world that no longer exists. But this discovery was different, because the moment researchers examined the jar, they noticed details that did not match ordinary ancient storage containers. The jar had a narrow opening. Inside was a rolled copper sheet forming a cylinder. A rod of iron passed through the center. The bottom of the copper cylinder appeared sealed with a bitumen-like material, a natural substance used in the ancient world as an adhesive and waterproofing material. The design looked intentional. Someone had carefully placed these materials together. The question was, why? What was this object built to do? At first, some researchers considered a simple explanation. Maybe it was a container. Perhaps it held scrolls, pigments, sacred materials, or valuable objects. Ancient people often created containers with unusual shapes, but the arrangement inside was too specific. A copper cylinder, an iron rod, a sealed clay vessel, three materials positioned together like components. Then came the idea that changed everything. In 1938, German archaeologist Wilhelm König examined the object and proposed something extraordinary. Maybe this was not a container. Maybe it was a battery. The theory was simple. Place an acidic liquid inside the clay jar. The liquid would surround the copper and iron. The two different metals could create an electrical reaction, a small current, not enough to power machines, not enough to light a modern lamp, but enough to demonstrate that ancient people may have understood a basic form of electricity. And suddenly, the tiny artifact became something much bigger. It became a challenge to our understanding of the ancient world, because the timeline seemed impossible. The first true modern batteries appeared in the early 1800s, but this object was believed to be around 2,000 years old. Could someone in ancient Mesopotamia have discovered battery technology before modern science? The idea captured the imagination of the world.
Carefully.
Newspapers, researchers, and inventors became fascinated. The image was incredible. An ancient engineer sitting thousands of years ago, combining metals and liquids, unknowingly creating a device that would not be recognized for centuries. But archaeology is not built on imagination. It is built on evidence. And when scientists began testing the theory, they found something interesting. A recreated version of the artifact could actually produce a small electrical charge.
Scientists eventually built replicas, and surprisingly, they produced a small electrical current. That's fascinating. But just because something can work that way doesn't automatically mean that's what it was designed for.
The experiment worked. The jar could function. like a basic battery.
Once someone suggested it might work like a battery, people's imaginations took off, and I understand why it sounds incredible. But archaeology has a rule. Exciting ideas still need evidence.
But that created an even bigger mystery. Just because something can work, does that mean it was designed to work? A modern person can use a rock as a paperweight. That does not mean ancient people invented paperweights. Function and intention are not always the same. And this became the central debate around the Baghdad Battery. Some researchers believed the object was evidence of forgotten technology. Others argued there was no proof ancient people used it as an electrical device. The strongest argument against the battery theory was simple. Where was the evidence of electricity in the ancient world? Where were the wires, the machines, the electrical tools, the written records? Nothing clearly connected the artifact to power generation. Instead, other explanations began appearing. Some historians suggested it may have been used in ancient craftsmanship. Perhaps it was related to a process called electroplating, using electricity to place a thin layer of metal onto another object. But again, there was a problem. There was no direct evidence proving this. The Baghdad Battery had become something unusual in archaeology, a discovery with many possible answers, but no final answer.
Here's the frustrating part. Ancient artifacts don't come with instruction manuals. We can examine every scratch and every material, but nobody left us a note saying, "Here's how this thing works."
And that is what made it fascinating, because the mystery was no longer, did ancient people make a battery? The deeper question became how much ancient knowledge has been lost to time. Civilizations rise and fall, libraries burn, cities disappear beneath sand, technologies are forgotten, and sometimes thousands of years later, all we find is one strange object buried underground, waiting for someone to ask the right question. A small clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and a mystery that refuses to disappear. To understand the mystery of the Baghdad Battery, we have to understand the world that created it. Because the biggest mistake people make when looking at ancient civilizations is imagining them as primitive. They were not. More than 2,000 years ago, Mesopotamia was already a center of human innovation. This was a world of mathematicians, engineers, astronomers, and the skilled craftsmen. They built cities where thousands of people lived together. They created systems to move water across dry landscapes. They developed advanced methods of working with metals. They understood materials. They understood chemistry. They understood that different substances could react with each other. And that is exactly why the Baghdad Battery mystery remains so interesting. Because the idea itself is not impossible. Ancient people had the knowledge needed to create something like it. They had copper, they had iron, they had acidic liquids, they had the ability to seal containers. The ingredients existed. The question was whether they combined them intentionally.
People often underestimate ancient civilizations. These weren't primitive societies stumbling through history. They were engineers, metalworkers, mathematicians, people who solved problems every single day.
Some researchers believe the answer could be connected to ancient decoration techniques. One theory suggests the device may have been used for electroplating, a process where a thin layer of precious metal is applied to another surface. Imagine an ancient craftsman trying to cover a cheap metal object with a layer of gold. A small electrical current could theoretically help move metal ions from one place to another. If true, the Baghdad Battery would not have been a power source for machines. It would have been a tool for creating luxury objects. a hidden piece of ancient craftsmanship. But again, the evidence is incomplete. No workshop was discovered with dozens of these devices. No ancient text was found explaining the process. The mystery remained, and then another possibility appeared. Maybe the jar had nothing to do with electricity at all. Some historians suggested it could have been a storage container, a scroll holder, a ritual object, a container connected to ancient religious practices. Because in archaeology, appearance can be deceptive.
One thing I admire about archaeology is that good researchers are comfortable saying, "We don't know." That's not weakness, that's honesty. Sometimes the evidence simply isn't enough to reach a final conclusion.
A modern person finding a smartphone thousands of years from now might create a completely wrong theory about its purpose. They might study the materials, they might discover the screen, they might notice the charging port, but without the right context, they could misunderstand everything. The same problem exists with the Baghdad Battery. We have the object, but we do not have the story behind the object. And that missing story is what makes archaeology so challenging. The people who created it are gone. Their voices disappeared. Their intentions disappeared. All that remains is a silent artifact waiting to be interpreted. But there is another reason this discovery captured worldwide attention. It challenged the way we think about ancient knowledge. History is often presented like a straight line. Ancient people discover fire, then farming, then metal, then machines, then electricity. But reality is much messier. Human knowledge is not a perfect staircase. It is a collection of discoveries, forgotten ideas, lost techniques, and unexpected breakthroughs. A civilization can master one area while knowing nothing about another. A technology can appear, disappear, and be forgotten for centuries. And sometimes the evidence is buried underground, waiting. The Baghdad Battery represents that uncertainty. It sits between two worlds. One explanation says this was an accidental arrangement of ancient materials. Another says this was a deliberate invention ahead of its time. And somewhere between those possibilities is the truth.
History isn't just about objects, it's about context. Remove the story behind an artifact, and suddenly even the smartest experts can spend decades arguing over what they're looking at. Whether this was truly a battery almost isn't the point anymore. The real value is that it reminds us how much of human history is still waiting to be understood.
Whether the Baghdad Battery was truly an ancient electrical device or not, the discovery tells us something important. Ancient civilizations were not waiting for the modern world to teach them how to innovate. They were innovators themselves. They were engineers. They were problem solvers. They were explorers of the natural world. And perhaps the biggest lesson from this mysterious jar is that history is much larger than the stories we already know. The timeline of human progress is not a straight road. It is filled with forgotten paths, ideas that appeared and vanished, technologies that were created and lost, knowledge that disappeared when civilizations collapsed. Every archaeological discovery is a message from people who lived before us, a reminder that the past was not empty. It was alive, it was creative, it was constantly searching for answers.
The Baghdad Battery leaves us with a question that's far more interesting than the answer. How many remarkable ideas have been lost, not because they never existed, but because history simply forgot them?
Today, researchers continue examining the artifact. New discoveries, new technology, and new archaeological methods may one day reveal more. Perhaps future evidence will prove exactly what the jar was used for. Perhaps another discovery will be found buried somewhere nearby. Perhaps another ancient object will finally provide the missing piece. Until then, the Baghdad Battery remains what it has always been, A small object carrying a very big question. A question about invention. A question about lost knowledge. A question about how much humanity achieved before modern history began. Thousands of years ago, someone shaped clay, copper, and iron into an object whose purpose would be debated long after they were gone. They could never have imagined that their creation would still be studied, still questioned, still inspiring wonder. Because sometimes the past does not disappear. Sometimes it leaves behind a clue. And sometimes a simple clay jar can make us look at human history in an entirely different way.
I always tell my students, if ancient inventors could hear us arguing about their little clay jar 2,000 years later, they'd probably get a pretty good laugh out of it.